The first officer through the door stopped, not because of what she saw, because of what she did not see. 11 years on the force had trained her body to read crime scenes before her mind caught up. The specific physical vocabulary of forced entry, of struggle, of the particular disorder that violence leaves behind in the space that was ordered before it arrived. She knew what that vocabulary looked like. She knew it in her body before she knew it in her notes. This scene had none of it. The door had been unlocked. The rooms were arranged with an ordinariness that was itself wrong. Not the ordinary of a space that had simply been lived in, but the ordinary of a space that had been returned to ordinary after something had been done inside it. Small things. The kind of details that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything to someone who knew how to read them. A chair positioned slightly too deliberately. A surface wiped in a pattern that cleaning does not naturally produce. A stillness that was a wrong kind of still. She moved through the room slowly. On the kitchen counter, pushed slightly toward the wall, as though someone had straightened it without thinking, was a coffee mug with lipstick on the rim. Beside it, a set of keys on a hook labeled in someone's careful handwriting. On the refrigerator, a photograph held by a magnet, a woman, mid-30s, laughing at something happening just outside the frame. She had been someone's whole life a day ago. She stood in the doorway and wrote 3 words in her notebook. No forced entry. She did not yet know those 3 words would eventually point not outward, toward a stranger, toward a break-in, toward the conventional architecture of crime that comes from outside, but inward, toward someone who had a key, toward someone who knew the house, toward someone who had been trusted inside it long before the night it became a crime scene. She did not yet know that the person those 3 words would eventually point toward was already on his way. Already dressed in the same uniform she was wearing, already carrying the same badge. The scene had been written by someone who understood exactly how investigators read. That was the first thing nobody understood. It would be the last thing proven. He arrived 12 minutes after the first call. That detail, 12 minutes, would later be examined from every angle by people trying to understand how long he had known, how much he had prepared, and what the specific arithmetic of those 12 minutes contained. But on the morning he arrived, 12 minutes was simply professional, expected, the response time of a man who took his work seriously and lived close enough to the district that serious work reached him quickly. He walked through the door and did the thing that made him the officer everyone called when something difficult needed handling with both skill and care. He slowed down, where other officers were already moving, already cataloging, already photographing, already building the procedural momentum of an investigation finding its initial shape. He stopped. He stood in the center of the room and looked, not at the evidence, in space, at the particular quality of what the scene was communicating before anyone had decided what it meant. His partner would describe this later to InternalAffairs as the thing she had always admired most about him. He never rushed the scene, she said. He always said the scene was trying to tell you something, and if you moved too fast, you talked over it. She said it as a tribute. It would later be understood as something else entirely. He had been on the force for 11 years. The commendations on his record were genuine, earned in the way that commendations are earned by people who are actually good at their work rather than people who are good at appearing to be. He had handled cases that required both precision and compassion in equal measure, and had delivered both without the performance that lesser officers brought to difficult moments. But it was his work with victims' families that people mentioned first. Always first. There had been a family 18 months before this morning, a different case, a different house, whose daughter had been killed in circumstances that required weeks of investigation before charges were filed. He had sat with that family through every one of those weeks, not procedurally, not as an obligation. He had shown up on evenings that had nothing to do with the case's official requirements and sat with them in their living room while they tried to understand what had happened to their child. The mother of that family would later attend his trial. She would sit in the gallery on the prosecution side, and she would not look at him once across 3 weeks of proceedings. But this morning he was simply the officer everyone trusted, the one whose presence made the first responding officers exhale slightly, not because he took over, but because his arrival communicated that the case was now being handled by someone who understood how to handle it. He stood in the center of the room. He looked at the scene with the attention of a man who knew exactly what had happened inside it. The coffee mug on the kitchen counter, the keys on the hook with their careful handwriting, the photograph on the refrigerator, the woman laughing at something just outside the frame. He looked at all of it and did not look away from any of it, and felt nothing that was not useful. That was the thing his composure had always concealed. Not absence of feeling, but the discipline of a man who had learned to use feeling as a tool and had been using it. In this room, as in every room he had entered across 11 years of professional life, as cover, the investigation moved forward with the efficiency of a department that had a competent lead and no reason to doubt him. He ran the canvas personally. That was not unusual. Lead investigators frequently conduct neighbor interviews in the early stages of a case, particularly when the crime scene has not yet produced a clear direction. It was a procedure. It was competence. It was exactly what a department would expect from the officer they had assigned to handle something difficult. But the neighbors remembered things. Not suspicious things. Not at the time, not in the framework available to people who had no reason yet to organize what they had observed into anything other than ordinary neighborhood detail. Things that were individually explainable and collectively significant only in retrospect. The way he had been at the victim's house in the weeks before her death, with a frequency that one neighbor noticed, but did not flag, because frequency alone is not evidence of anything. The conversation a neighbor had overheard through a fence on an afternoon approximately 10 days before the crime. Not an argument, nothing that dramatic, just a conversation with quality of tension that the neighbor had filed away under the ordinary category of two people working through something difficult. The kind of tension that exists in many relationships and is not worth mentioning until someone creates a framework in which it becomes worth mentioning. He created that framework himself. He sat across from each neighbor with his notebook open and his expression carrying the attentiveness that his partner had always admired. Unhurried, patient. The quality of a listener who makes a person feel that what they're saying matters. He asked the right questions. He wrote down the answers. What he did not write down was everything. The neighbor who mentioned the frequency of his visits. That detail appeared in no official record. The conversation through the fence, documented as routine neighbor contact, the tension of it unrecorded, the observation one neighbor offered almost as an afterthought about the expression on his face driving away from the house on a particular afternoon, was noted briefly and then absorbed into a summary paragraph that rendered it unremarkable. He was not falsifying evidence. He was editing the picture, deciding, with the calm precision of a man who understood exactly which details the investigation needed to not find, which observation survived documentation, and which dissolved quietly into the administrative machinery of a canvas that he controlled from beginning to end. The neighbors had given him everything. He had given the investigation only what served him. Evidence does not know it is being managed. It simply exists in notebooks, in memories, in digital records no one has yet thought to request, waiting with the indifference of something that does not need be believed to be true. 3 weeks into the investigation, a piece of evidence surfaced that should have redirected everything. A junior detective, the same officer who had been present at the initial canvass, who had written up 3 of the neighbor interviews under his direction, who had been building her understanding of the case on the foundation he had constructed, found a digital record, specific, time-stamped, precise. It placed him at a location inconsistent with the account he had given of his movements on the night in question. Not dramatically inconsistent. Not the kind of discrepancy that announces itself and demands immediate action. Inconsistent in the way that a careful investigator looking at it, without preconception, would flag as requiring clarification. A gap of 40 minutes. A location that did not match. A timestamp that predated the alibi he had provided by enough to matter. She brought it to her supervisor quietly, professionally, framing it exactly as it should have been framed, not as an accusation, not as a conclusion, simply as something that probably had an explanation but warranted clarification before the investigation moved further in the direction it was moving. The supervisor brought it to him directly. He had an explanation. It was good, specific enough to carry credibility, simple enough to be processed without requiring additional verification, delivered in the tone of a man who had been asked a reasonable question and was providing a reasonable answer, not defensive, not over-explained, not the performance of innocence, but the professional response of someone who understood that procedural questions were part of the process. He walked them through his movements. The timeline was resolved. The gap was accounted for. The location was explained by an errand that cross-referenced with one other piece of existing evidence just sufficiently to close the question. The supervisor accepted it, almost immediately, with the institutional speed of a department that trusted its lead and had no framework yet for not trusting him. The junior detective picked up her pen, set it down, picked it up again, and wrote it up. The investigation moved forward, one door closing. She filed the instinct away, the particular discomfort of a person who has been given a satisfactory answer to a question whose answer she had not quite finished forming when the answer arrived. She would not file the next one away. But the next one was still 14 months in the future. She had seen something. She had been resolved before she was ready. That gap between what she sensed and what she was given permission to act on was the gap he had been counting on since the moment he walked through the door. 6 weeks into the investigation, he brought a name forward. He presented it the way he presented everything, methodically, without drama, with the specific patience of a man who would follow the evidence wherever it led and arrived at a conclusion he had not been looking for but could not responsibly ignore. The documentation was clean. The reasoning was sound. The case file he assembled around the new name was the work of a thorough investigator doing his job correctly. The man he identified had a history, a previous incident, not a conviction, but a record contact with law enforcement that established a behavioral profile consistent with the kind of person investigators were looking for. He had known the victim, not closely. The connection was peripheral, the kind of proximity that exists in overlapping social circles rather than in deliberate relationship. But he had known her. He had been seen near her neighborhood in the weeks before her death. His alibi for the night in question had gaps that he filled with the nervous, over-explained energy of a person who understood that gaps required filling and was not certain his fillings were convincing. When investigators questioned him, he could not stay still. His hands moved constantly. His eyes tracked the investigators rather than meeting them. The specific sideways attention of a person managing their presentation rather than simply responding to questions. He contradicted himself twice on minor details across a single interview. He had the behavioral signature of someone with something to conceal and the specific anxiety of someone who knew concealment was not going well. He was not guilty, but he looked exactly like someone who might be, which was precisely why he had been selected. The department shifted focus. The lead investigator, the one who had brought the name forward, the one who had built the case file, the one whose judgment the department had trusted across 6 weeks of careful investigation, gave a press briefing in which he spoke about the development with a measured restraint of a professional who understood the difference between a person of interest and a confirmed suspect. He was careful with language. He was always careful with language. The community exhaled slightly. Here was a direction. Here was the shape of an answer forming where before there had been only the formless anxiety of an unsolved crime in a familiar neighborhood. The victim's family, who had been sitting with investigator silence for 6 weeks, heard the briefing and felt, for the first time, something that resembled the earliest edge of resolution. He called them that evening. He told them they were making progress, that he was not going to stop, that she deserved someone who would not stop. He meant none of it. The alternative suspect's alibi was eventually verified. Fully, the investigation stalled. He expressed appropriate frustration. And the case file he had buried 6 weeks earlier continued to sit in the administrative record exactly where he had left it, waiting not for him, but for the person who would eventually arrive without his instructions about what to find. He led the search teams personally. 2 months after the crime, with the alternative suspect cleared and the investigation returned to its original formlessness, the department organized a formal search of the surrounding area. Standard procedure for a case that had not produced a clear evidentiary direction. He volunteered to lead it before he was asked. His colleagues noted this as dedication. He organized a search grid with the methodical precision of someone who understood the terrain, who understood, specifically, which areas required thorough coverage and which areas the grid could move through more quickly without losing investigative integrity. The teams followed his direction without question because his direction had always been worth following. They did not find anything that changed the investigation. They were not going to. The memorial service was held on a Saturday morning, in the kind of weather that makes grief feel appropriate. Gray and still, the specific atmospheric weight of a day that is decided to match what is happening inside it. The community turned out in the way that communities turn out when something has frightened them, not just to mourn but to reassert, through collective presence, that the neighborhood was still the neighborhood, that the loss was real but the life around it continued. He attended in full dress uniform. He stood near the front. When the victim's mother spoke, when she described her daughter with a specific, unguarded love of a parent who has not yet learned to use the past tense correctly, he stood with his head slightly bowed and his expression arranged into a particular quality of professional grief that communities recognize as appropriate from the officers who serve them. After the service, her family gathered near the entrance. Her mother found him first. She took his hand in both of hers and said something that the people nearby heard as gratitude, that she was grateful for how hard he was working, that she could see it, that her daughter would have trusted him. She said the last part specifically. Her daughter would have trusted him. He held her hands. He looked her in the eye, and he said he would not stop until there was justice. He said it with a steadiness that had defined everything about him from the first morning, the steadiness that his partner had described as the thing she had always admired most. It was the most precise lie he ever told, because he was the justice this family was waiting for. 3 weeks later, he attended a community fundraiser held in the victim's name. He spoke at the podium. He was photographed accepting a check on behalf of the investigation. He shook hands with her brother. Her brother thanked him, gripped his hand with both of his the way people grip the hands of people they are counting on, looked him in the eye, and said, "Don't stop." He did not stop. He had never stopped. The only question, still 14 months from being answered, was what exactly he had never stopped doing. 14 months after the crime, a forensic digital specialist was assigned to re-examine the case. Not because new evidence had surfaced, because the case had stalled with a specific, embarrassing completeness of an investigation that had produced no arrest, no viable suspect, and no evidentiary direction capable of moving it forward. Cold case protocols required a fresh set of eyes on the digital record. The specialist who received the file had no prior involvement with the investigation. She had no relationship with the lead detective. She had no framework for what she was supposed to find. Only the file as it existed and the instruction to read it without the assumptions the original investigation had built into it. She found a discrepancy on the third day, not buried, not hidden with particular sophistication, present in the digital record with the calm availability of something that had simply been waiting for a reader who arrived without instructions about what to overlook. A timestamp, specifically a location ping from a device registered to the lead investigator, recovered from the telecommunications record of the case's primary communication channel, placing him in an address that did not appear anywhere in the official case documentation. Not inconsistently, not vaguely, precisely, the kind of precision that digital records produce when they have not been told they are being used as evidence and have simply recorded what occurred. The address was hers, not the crime scene address. A second address, a location that appeared nowhere in his canvas documentation, nowhere in his supplemental reports, nowhere in 14 months of investigative record that he had personally assembled and personally controlled. A location that established, with the indifference of a system that does not know what it is recording, that he had been somewhere he had never told anyone he had been. She read it twice. She printed it. She walked it directly to the senior investigator on the cold case unit, rather than routing it through the standard documentation channel. An instinct she would later describe as the specific professional unease of a person who does not yet know what they have found, but understands that whatever it should not travel through ordinary systems before someone with authority has seen it. The senior investigator read it once, read it again, set it down, and picked up the phone. Not to call the lead investigator, to call Internal Affairs. He had controlled everything he knew about. The timestamp recorded something he did not know he had left. That is a specific cruelty of digital evidence. It preserves what people do not know they are doing. Internal Affairs moved quietly. That was the first thing, the specific, deliberate quiet of an investigation that understood its subject was still inside the building, still attending briefings, still running the case he had buried from the inside, and would use any signal of approaching scrutiny to prepare defenses that an investigation as carefully constructed could not afford to dismantle after fact. They watched him for 11 days before he knew he was being watched, and what they watched told them everything the digital record had only suggested. The first crack appeared on a Thursday morning. A colleague stopped him in the corridor to ask a routine question about a different case, a question that had nothing to do with the investigation, nothing to do with the victim, nothing to do with the 14 months of careful management he had been sustaining. A question so ordinary that it required no particular thought to answer. He answered it in 12 words, then stopped, then answered again in different words. As though the first answer had not satisfied a check he was running internally that nobody else in the corridor could hear. His colleague noted it as an off day, did not mention it again. Internal Affairs noted it as the first visible seam. The second crack came 4 days later. A departmental briefing. Weekly, routine, the kind of meeting he had attended without visible strain for 11 years. Halfway through, he checked his phone. Not quickly, not covertly, but with the specific quality of a man who has forgotten that he is in a room and remembered something that exists outside it. He checked it twice more before the briefing ended. The partner who had sat beside him in briefings for 6 years had never seen him look at his phone. During one, she mentioned it to no one. Internal Affairs had a record of it before she reached her desk. The third crack was the one that mattered. A supplemental report he filed on the 14th month of the investigation. A routine update required by cold case protocol, submitted 3 days after a forensic specialist had walked the timestamp to the senior investigator, contained a description of his movements on the night of the crime that contradicted, in one specific and irreconcilable detail, the account he had given in his original supplemental filing. Not dramatically, not obviously, in the way that contradictions appear when a man is managing too many versions of the same story simultaneously and does not remember, at the moment of writing, which version belongs to which document. The original account had placed him traveling east. The new account placed him traveling west. One direction, 14 months apart. Irreconcilable without dismantling the timeline he had been living inside since the first morning. Internal Affairs placed the two documents side by side, and the partner who had described his composure as the thing she had always admired most, who had watched him slow down every scene he ever entered, who had believed for 11 years that his calm belonged to a man with nothing to hide, sat in a corridor outside her supervisor's office and understood, with the arriving weight of something that cannot be unfelt once it has landed, what the calm had actually been, not character, cover. The calmest person in the room had been calm because he had already decided everything that everyone else was still trying to figure out. That is not composure. That is the specific stillness of a man who finished his thinking before anyone else arrived. They brought him in on a Tuesday morning, not dramatically, not with the public spectacle that his eventual arrest would produce. Quietly, a message from his commander asking him to come in for what was described as an administrative review. The specific language chosen by people who understood that their subject had institutional knowledge and would use any warning to prepare a version of events rather than arrive at a room that already contained the truth. He walked in with a professional composure fully assembled. 11 years of it, every commendation, every victim's family he had sat with, every scene he had slowed down to read before anyone else had finished moving. All of it was present in the way he carried himself through the corridor and into the room and sat down across the table from two people he did not recognize. Internal Affairs investigators, and beside them forensic specialists whose presence told him, in the language of a man who understood institutional procedure completely, that this was not an administrative review. On the table between them were 4 documents. The digital record placing him at the scene, time-stamped, forensically verified, positioned with a precision of data that does not negotiate and does not accept explanations built after fact. The map of omissions assembled from his own reports. 14 months of neighbor details that had not survived documentation. Observations absorbed into summary paragraphs. The pattern of a man editing a picture from inside the frame. The supplemental report discrepancy. His own words contradicting his own earlier words in a way that only occurs when a man is managing too many versions of a truth simultaneously and loses track of which version belongs to which document. And the 4th document, the one he had not known existed, a series of messages recovered from the victim's personal accounts. Private exchanges sent in the weeks before her death that established, with the authority of communications written before either party knew they would become evidence, that his presence in her life had been something other than professional, that the relationship he had constructed a narrative around had been contradicted in her own words, sent a friend, describing his behavior in terms that made professional impossible to use. She had documented him without knowing she was documenting him, and the arithmetic of his arrival. 12 minutes after the first call, the detail his colleagues had read as professional dedication landed against those messages with the specific weight of a timeline that no longer had an innocent explanation. He looked at the 4 documents. The investigator said nothing, let the silence run. At 43 seconds, his hands moved. Just slightly. Just once. The flat, controlled hands that his partner had watched for 11 years shifted on the table surface and did not return to their original position. Stage 1 arrived carefully. Qualified. Each word chosen with the precision of a man constructing a defense in real time. He acknowledged proximity. He acknowledged the relationship in terms designed to minimize it. Then the 2nd document was placed beside the 1st. He looked at it, then at the 1st, then at the 2nd again. The investigators did not speak. The room held the specific quality of 4 minutes in which a man understands that the architecture he has been living inside is no longer standing, not collapsing dramatically, not falling with noise, but simply no longer there when he reaches for it. He reached for it twice. Both times his hand found nothing. Stage 3 arrived without the composure that had defined every version of himself he had ever presented to any room he had ever entered. The room he could not control was the first room in 11 years that already knew everything he knew. That asymmetry, being fully understood by people he could not mislead, was a thing of performance had never been built to survive. He was convicted. The verdict delivered on a Thursday morning into a courtroom that had been filling since before the doors officially opened. Her family on one side, his former colleagues on the other, and the man who had buried the investigation maintaining throughout 3 weeks of proceedings the same composed expression he had carried from the first morning in that house through every interview, every press briefing, every memorial service appearance, every hand he had shaken, and every eye he had looked into while building the distance between what he had done and when it would be proven. The sentence arrived into complete silence. He was let out. The expression did not change. The performance, having nowhere left to go, simply continued, because for a man who had lived inside a performance long enough, the performance stops being a choice and becomes the only available response to any room he is placed in. His former colleagues sat in the gallery with the expressions of people being asked to reorganize a decade of shared memory around a truth that makes most of it unrecognizable. The partner who had described her composure as the thing she had always admired most sat in the 2nd row and did not look at the defense table once. The victim's family sat across from them. They thanked him. That was the detail that would not resolve. The mother who had taken his hands in both of hers outside the memorial service. The brother who had gripped his hand at the fundraiser and said, "Don't stop," and meant every word of it. The family who had accepted his presence at every stage of their grief and understood it as shared mourning. The brother sat in the gallery now and looked at those same hands resting flat on the defense table, and understood in the specific silence of a courtroom receiving a verdict that the hands he had gripped had never been reaching back. That retroactive rewriting does not respond to verdicts. It simply becomes part of what was taken. The junior detective sat in the back row, dark blazer. She had not opened the notepad. Right too late. She did not look satisfied. She looked like a person who understood that being right too late is its own taxonomy of loss. Structural, not personal, and therefore harder to name and harder to fix. What this case demands, and what this story exists to say without softening, is this: trust is not proof. Calm is not innocence. And the person with the most institutional access has the most capacity to use that access in both directions. Pay attention to who controls the story. Pay attention to who benefits from what is never found. Pay attention to the person who is always the calmest in the room, and ask yourself whether that calm belongs to someone who has nothing to hide or to someone who has already hidden everything that matters. Behind every crime is a lesson. Behind this one, there was a man trusted to find the truth who used that trust to bury it. Let that be what we carry forward, and let her be the reason we carry it.